This is the first of a series called Aussie AFA History. AFA stands for Anti-Fascist Action. Not everything I cover in these videos will have described itself as that, as anti-fascist action, but I'm using that as a helpful umbrella term that it lets me look at a whole bunch of important, interesting, or bizarre moments from the history of anti-fascist or anti-racist or anti-state or any other form of radical action throughout Australia that might have involved fighting back against organised bigots or authoritarians. Some of these stories are not popularly told often, some of them are completely forgotten, so I want to retell them. For my first instalment, we're going to look at Dial-A-Ninja, and that is a brief, beautiful moment in time in Australia where you could briefly get ninjas to bash racists. To situate you, we need to take you back in time to Perth in the 1980s. At that time, a campaign of intimidation and later outright violence was being waged throughout the city by a group of neo-Nazi Hitlerites called the Australian Nationalist Movement, or the ANM. They were led by a violent ex-military show pony by the name of Jack Van Tongeren, and their focus was on Asian immigration.
The fact that you've got too many Asians here that are not assimilating will cause violence.
Their plan was to recruit a membership base from cultivating race hate against Asians in the way that neo-Nazis generally do, and in time to commit violent attacks on the courts and parliament. They did have grand designs. Ultimately, in fact, they planned to launch a hostile takeover of the Australian government and install the ANM, and specifically Van Tongeren, as leader.
Tape recordings were played in court describing a plot for an armed revolution, political murder and a neo-Nazi ANM government for Australia.
I'm drawing for this from the work of Vashti Jane Fox, who wrote an excellent piece on the history of fascism and anti-fascism in Perth in the 1980s. Vashti highlights the particularly racist and anti-immigration Western Australian state government at that time, and also the fact that the head of the RSL at that time was a really vocal opponent of immigration.
Okay, you don't want black Africans in this country.
No, we don't want black. I'll tell you.
Jack Van Tongeren was a Vietnam veteran with a pathological hatred of Asians and, like Bruce Ruxton, an obsession with ending Asian immigration. So this is context. And this is important. You know, it's important that we remember that, because fringe neo-Nazi organisation doesn't really actually happen in a fringe vacuum. It usually just parasitises whatever form of discrimination is in vogue at that time. And the people that engender what's in vogue is usually the media and government. At first, the ANM's activities were focused on postering and flyering, and they were bombarding the city. It was everywhere that you could find racist ANM flyers. But in 1988, they ramped it up significantly. They began firebombing Chinese restaurants.
The smell of burnt wood and plastic hung in the air at Watley Crescent this morning as firefighters tried to determine the cause of last night's blaze. It was spotted by an off-duty police officer around 3 a.m. and it was past 6 this morning before it was out. But Chinese restaurant fires have been happening all too frequently for the Perth Fire Brigade. More than a dozen have gone up in smoke since July, and around 80% were firebombed.
Then they began a series of armed robberies with the intention of accumulating funds to wage these increasingly violent hostilities. They really were a train wreck in motion. Anti-racist opposition to the ANM did occur. One early opposing group was called Campaign Against Racist Exploitation, or CARE, and later there was a group called Aussies Against Racism, or AAR. Let me touch on a couple of differences while we're here between what people call anti-racist action and anti-fascist action, just in layman's terms if you're not in the know. Anti-fascist action could imply a more fully formed political lens. Anti-racist action could imply a more basic political framework and a broader church. Some anti-racist efforts back then imagined maybe a wider popular appeal in the anti-racist moniker, reasoning perhaps that Anti-fascist action requires a basic understanding of fascism, which is a pretty slippery political model, by design. Sometimes people can only see the way that neo-Nazi groups agitate around race. Sometimes people don't want to see the other targets of fascists. It all depends, to be honest. It depends on the activists, it depends on the context, and it actually also depends on the racists in question too. You see, we know that the ANM were neo-Nazi Hitlerites, but they were also cloaking the fascist stuff beneath a sort of localised Australian nationalism. So the racism stuff was really their sole public angle. This is a fascist's way of trying to get more people on board and to be a broader church themselves. Like, in private, they love Hitler, but in public, they drape wattle over a Eureka flag and wear brand new Akubras and bat off to the Lambing Flat riots. Anyway, anti-racist groups from Perth at the time were relatively small, and they were focused mostly on campaigns of ripping down these A&M posters and stickers, which, as I said, were being put up absolutely everywhere at that time. But as I think I said before, these Nazis obviously meant business. In Vashti's piece, she relayed an account from an AAR member who almost got kidnapped and murdered by A&M infiltrators, and they were saved only by a car that happened to be passing by just as 8 Nazis in balaclavas were about to haul them into their Datsun to whisk them away to apparently kill them. So this shit was heavy, Asians in Perth were in clear and present physical danger. Anti-racist activists were in danger. That was the state of play in 1988 and 1989. And that is where ninjas come in. Enter a guy called John Ang, who was the president of a group called the World Ninja Society based in Perth, and ran a dojo over there that delivered training in ninjutsu, a modern training school. It was styled as for ninja arts. There's a lot of dubious claims over the legitimacy of training people to be like modern renditions of clandestine Japanese assassins of antiquity, but it's almost another story. Whether it was a PR angle or not, John Ang definitely trained people in some kind of martial arts in a dojo in Perth at that time, and he called it ninjutsu, or studying to be a ninja. And in 1989, in response to the threat of the A&M, John Ang kicked off Dial a Ninja.
The poster campaign was just not enough for Jack Van Tongeren and the A&M. So when I was here 5 years ago, when I look at the situation, I felt that enough is enough. I mean, there's no way things should be allowed to go on as they were. And the only way I feel is to be able to put your foot down, stand up and say, look, we are not going to tolerate this nonsense anymore.
This was an anti-racist ninja squad you could call to come and protect you against racists and A&M Nazis. Ang said that the ranks of people ready to respond to calls through to Dial a Ninja numbered up to 1,000 strong at its peak. Their activities involved the tearing down of A&M's constant postering efforts and, of course, responding to calls.
At the peak of the A&M activities, you'll be very, very surprised that we do have, sometimes as many as about 20 or 30 calls a day, just one day. 20 to 30 calls a day, not a month, as many as that.
Now, did those phone calls result in Perthite ninjas belting the piss out of neo-Nazi boneheads? Who knows? I wasn't there. I can only dream. The intention behind Dial a Ninja was to protect the Asian community in the absence of the police, who were around, sure, but generally didn't seem to give a shit about the threat that the A&M posed people. Here's a WA police spokesperson in one of these articles saying that Dial a Ninja was not necessary and that the police had not received any reports of actual racial violence, despite the fact that a white Australian had actually bashed a Malaysian taxi driver to death in Perth just the year before that in 1988 because he, quote, didn't like the Chinese, unquote. So the cops weren't doing shit. They genuinely weren't that interested in organised racism. I remind you of what Vashti had said earlier that I mentioned, in her work about how the context of the government and the RSL and the like at the time helps you to situate their socio-political attitude towards race and racism. Why would the cops give a shit? No one else seemed to. Ang was also trying to prove to the world at large that Asians in Perth were not going to take the threat to their safety from racists and Nazis lying down. He'd made it clear, to be fair, that the group was majority white Australians, but he also wanted to counter the perception that Asian migrant communities had to roll over and accept the threat of Nazi violence. Certainly that resonated with me because I remember joining anti-fascist action efforts at a time where Muslims were the primary target of far-right and Nazi attentions. But I remember some pretty infantilising rhetoric from some corners, sort of explaining away a lack of collaboration with Muslim groups at rallies. People would literally say, I remember hearing this, that it was for their own good. I remember hearing that. And I think, tell that to the Middle Eastern sons of Coburg shop owners who found themselves running full pelt through the streets in 2016, trying to evade cop lines just to get around them so they could get to the Nazis. I'll save that tale for another one of these videos, I reckon. The Dial-A Ninja service did make some left activists concerned that it was only going to heighten tensions and that the real consequences would probably be suffered not by John Ang or some self-styled ninja, but by the next Chinese restaurant to be firebombed or, the next Asian to encounter the A&M in the streets. These are valid concerns. Sometimes these politically ambiguous, vague, stunt-style responses to organised racism can cause real problems. Blow-ins can sometimes appear, imagining they're the grand new hero of anti-racism, and undertake actions that are not only ill-considered, but also actually pose a danger for a real front line that they don't even know exists. Still, years on, as we are now, as time begins to obscure some of these community-led efforts to get back at Nazis, I think we can look back together and be glad that there was a small window of opportunity in the Australian timeline at which one could hypothetically see a bonehead on the street through the window, pick up one's old landline telephone and call for a ninja to go and see about them. What a special treat, eh? By 1990, the A&M had murdered one of their own members, a young bloke called David Locke, who they thought was a snitch. This continues a really long-standing tradition among organised neo-Nazi groups worldwide of sort of planning to kill lots of other people, but actually in the end going down for murdering their own mates.
Patriotic Australians are morally bound to change the system. Thus, we nationalists will do whatever is required to save our nation, regardless of draconian laws, regardless of Asian threats, come hell or high water. He who saves his nation does not break the law.
Does the A&M have a cache of arms and explosives?
No comment.
By this stage, the A&M were repeat arsonists, bomb makers, had thieved hundreds of thousands of dollars of goods and had murdered someone. So WA cops might not have cared about racism, but they couldn't ignore the A&M any longer. Jack Van Tongeren was arrested along with the rest of the A&M leadership, stuck with hundreds of charges and sentenced in 1990 to 18 years in jail. Nowadays, I'm told that Jack is living somewhere on the eastern seaboard of Australia, is well into his 70s, and is not quite dead yet. By the way, I can't finish this video without shouting out one article that I wasn't able to get my hands on, unfortunately, for this video. And it was from 1989 in an old paper from back at that time that used to be around called Australasian Post. The article was about Dial-A Ninja, and its headline was "Deadly Ninjas Crush Perth Racists." And that sentence is so perfect and so catchy that I keep saying it over and over in my head. Say it with me. Deadly ninjas crush Perth racists. If I were an anti-racist based in Perth, I might genuinely consider getting that shit tattooed on me. Deadly ninjas crush Perth racists. Deadly ninjas crush Perth racists. Impeccable. Cheers to Vashti Jane Fox for first alerting me to anti-racist Perthite ninjas, and of course to Slack Bastard, without whose ongoing work most history of modern anti-fascism would probably be forever vanished. You'll be able to read Vashti's history of fascism and anti-fascism in Perth in the 80s in an upcoming book called Fascism and Anti-Fascism in Australia, which I'm really looking forward to. It's edited by Jane Persian, Evan Smith and Vashti Fox, so definitely keep an eye out for that. Also, if you're interested in where I got the vast majority of these incredible clips dotted throughout this video from, most of them come from Nazi Supergrass, which is a 1993 documentary that covers a lot of what happened during the period of the A&M's activity, directed by David Bradbury. Really interesting viewing if you can find it. If you have suggestions for tales of Aussie anti-fascist action history that you want me to cover in future instalments, please just hit me up, please, by DMing me at Tom Tanuki on my Instagram or my Facebook or my Twitter. And if you appreciate my output, then please chuck me a dime at patreon.com/TomTanuki so I can keep doing more of it. Cheers.